Okay, thanks for being here. We've heard a lot about the water-sensitive cities over the last few years. Much of the talk has been about water and cities, but not much about sensitivity. The dictionary defines the act of being sensitive as having acute mental or emotional sensibility, being aware of and responsive to the feelings of others. It implies a relationship between people, but also between people and landscapes. Using this lens, I will talk today about our changing relationship to the river, a system which seems to have has received comparatively little coverage as part of the water-sensitive city. So, in terms of this sensitivity, what I'll identify as what gurus of romance have identified as the 5 stages of a romantic relationship actually played out between us as a culture and the river as a system. These will encompass romanticisation, a condition typical of the earliest phases of romance, domination, perhaps when a couple move in together, genuine engagement, hopefully, and finally, as many relationships have concluded, in humiliation. So we'll run through these various stages as they relate to the river. Consummation was mine. Sorry, I forgot that. That's an important. Okay, so firstly, to infatuation. So the Dutch came out here and they correctly assessed the Swan coastal plain as being barren and ecologically sterile from the perspective of European agriculture. They didn't get much past where Elizabeth Quay is now. But in 1827, the English, in the form of James Stirling and his botanist Charles Fraser, they actually travelled right up to Guildford and did some soil testing in the only part of the river that actually has, well, actually the only part of the Swan coastal plain that really has very good soils around Guildford. So they did their testing there and then presumed from that the whole plain was bountiful and rich. And they got quite carried away, as these sort of accounts from James Stirling's diary would indicate. He said the richness of the soil, the bright foliage of the shrubs, the majesty of the surrounding trees, the abrupt and red-coloured banks of the river occasionally seen, and the view of the blue mountains from which we were not far distant made the scenery of the spot as beautiful as anything I have ever witnessed. They came at the end of an uncommonly moist and cool summer, so everything was very green. And in the evening, a cool easterly wind would blow over their campsite. And Stirling concluded that there must be a snow-capped mountain range to the east of Perth, which was producing these cool winds. So it was very much this period of infatuation with the river reflected the relationship being in yet a sort of juvenile state, which is based on seeing what you want to see rather than perhaps what's actually there. This sort of romantic infatuation came to a sudden and swift end when settlers started to arrive in the Swan River colony in 1833. And the mood turned very much to one of dominating the river. This was because since the earliest European settlement, the river was deemed problematic. The swamps to the north of the city produced clouds of mosquitoes. And it was regarded in that respect that a more perfect purgatory could not be devised. They were quickly built over, but also polluted with sewage, and then later in the 19th century there were typhoid outbreaks. So these kind of wetland systems were problematic in the first instance of Perth settlement. This is the Arrowsmith plan from 1833, and it's characterised by the grid being laid out over this alien, sometimes frightening and problematic landscape to give boundedness and certainty and divide it up for neat pockets of real estate. It's notable for James Stirling laying out this terrace here, which is George's Terrace, which was to be an original, the riverside, a beautiful romantic riverside park. But in typical Perth fashion, the Swan River colony was very, very, there was corruption and there was a lot of land speculation going on, and when he took a holiday, he came back and found that his surveyor, Septimus Rowe, had flogged it off for real estate, starting a great sort of Perth tradition. So this park in time was very entombed under urbanism. You could say by 1833 that the romantic partners had moved in together and that the period of infatuation had come to an abrupt halt. The move for domination continued in the early 20th century. Because of a reputed lack of central parkland, there was Kings Park, that was a walk up the hill, and there was Queen's Park, but that was a fair way off to the east. There was a big push to actually start to reclaim the river. Perhaps in a way to kind of deliver this ghostly park that was actually lost to development, to recreate that, but actually out in the river. So we see between Barrack and William Streets the recreation ground of the Esplanade being built there. It was filled in with the dumping of fill, which resulted from hills within the what's now the central business district, being pushed down onto the water, and with horse dung. And yes, there's this kind of setting refers to this being an unconscious impulse to try and recreate the lost park, which is interesting. The zenith of plans to dominate the river and reclaim land from Perth water was reached in 1931 in the depths of the Great Depression. So Frank, some 70 years before Dubai, Frank Vincent, who was a local engineer, proposed an artificial island which was 120 hectares in size, which was to have a residential subdivision on it, a shopping centre, a golf links for the busy city man, and an aerodrome. This was during the depths of the Great Depression, and it was proposed as a way of reviving confidence in WA and providing traffic connections. As he explained, what is the use of our valuable asset, as Perth water has been referred to, if it causes us to become bankrupt in wealth? We are in a mire of financial depression. Let us therefore secure our progress. And certainly a project like this would have kept the boys busy and would have kept the economy ticking along. Would have been a great place for Crown Casino in the 1980s. And it would have incubated, interestingly, probably a quite extreme form of urbanism over time. Islands being equated with the easing of restraints to the mainland, Loch Ness being one example. He was not well loved by the citizens of Perth, and there were claims, well, letters to the editor in the West Australian at the time indicated it was a shame he wasn't lynched for his outrageous proposal against the beauty of Perth. But this was very much part of this move of domination of the river, of reclamation. And it really, we see this continuing even though Perth Island was never built. In the 1930s we get Langley Park is filled in, so again this unconscious desire to recreate this lost parkland. Harrison Island, which was otherwise Mataka, an archipelago of islands, consolidated into one big island, and then also South Perth foreshore. Now this had a pragmatic dimension. We were in the grip of the City Beautiful movement and the Garden City movement to a degree. It was considered that open space and handsome riverside parkland was both physically and morally uplifting and beneficial for populations. But I think there was also a very strong symbolic dimension to it, which was that the unsanitary intertidal zones, which are the most fertile areas of any aquatic system, from my understanding, was very much about the indigenous relationship to the river. They were hunting grounds. And I think there was a discomfort with this perceived to be unsanitary kind of landscape at the foot of our capital city. That this was not a landscape befitting a proud capital city as such as Perth was aspiring to become. So by bearing all that in a veneer of turf, you perform a kind of symbolic act of producing a tabula rasa. But of course they did that, and then, well, it's kind of boring. I mean, the parkland, which ended up entombed under urbanism, you can get a sense of what that would have been like when you go to Government House Gardens. It would have topography falling away down to the water, would have been quite beautiful. But this reclaimed kind of green belt down here was just flat. It ended up being much more expensive than they thought, and so they ran out of money for landscaping. Another typical Perth situation. And it really just became this sort of fairly barren kind of space. Not to say it doesn't have some function, but you would have to say it's not a park that delivers a lot of things for a lot of people. So of course in the 1960s there was a temptation to concentrate the kind of detritus of modernity in those sort of landscapes. So when the Main Roads Department in 1966 proposed this kind of freeway noose around central Perth that would have choked the life out of the city, of course they ran these sort of grade-separated junctions and multi-level freeways right across the foreshore, which would have absolutely truncated that connection. For those of you who grew up in Perth, you remember the City of Perth motto at the time: "Your car is as welcome as you are," and it certainly would have been in that scheme. Luckily it didn't get built. But there's a kind of, we managed to dodge some of these terrible outcomes, but I think by the 1980s there's a kind of romanticisation around the river again, which is that native, in the 70s as well, native gardens are becoming popular, and there's a desire to reconnect with the beauty of this original landscape, such as Stirling would have experienced it. And we start to see schemes like this produced by City Vision, which was published on the front page of the West Australian, which is reintroducing a more naturalistic, to some degree, river's edge, actually vegetating it and turning it more into a park. And it's more romantic, and it's about bringing the city down to the river and actually animating that park to some degree. The City of Perth had been caught on the hop a bit by this unsolicited proposal, and then in 1988 they started to do surveys of what people wanted from the river. We talk about romanticisation of the river, and you can see that, I think, in this preference. These bars indicate people like it a lot. This indicates people don't like it a lot. You know, people were really very, very entranced with the idea of a natural river's edge. They didn't mind open grass fields and undulating river edges, but it was very much about a naturalistic conception of the river. That was our prevailing view of it. But ideas such as buildings on jetties, or, you know, God help us, waterfront buildings, very, very unpopular. So evidently the kind of image of the river that Sterling depicted in his journal all those years before is still bubbling away in the subconscious of the city. We still see the river as an escape from the city, or at least we did in 1988. And then there's competition. The City of Perth ran a competition which was won by a team from Boston, including Kevin Leach, which also worked in a very romantic mode of actually bringing the river back to its original shoreline along Terrace Road, a big follicle-shaped jetty with a Swan Island for swans to roost in, where tourists could get a nice postcard view back to Perth. But very much a landscape solution to the problems of the foreshore. However, the Carmen Lawrence government crashed and burned, and so did the scheme in 1989, I think it was. So there's a flurry of schemes which I won't trouble you with now, but the next significant one is probably in about 2008, and this is really about consummation. Okay, so we've had a bit of infatuation, a bit of domination. We've been a bit romantic, but now things are starting to get serious, and we're bringing the city together and the river together in a kind of embrace of the two. And we get this scheme which was produced by Ashton Raggett McDougall, which actually looked to bring the river in via this river circle, which was the same scale of the Wacker ground, which is perceived to be significant, encircled by urbanism and a real sort of urban embrace of the river. It emerged out of a kind of view of Perth at the time, for those who were here, which was that Perth was Dullsville. And you know, locals would call it that, it wasn't just guests, but we also had such a kind of cultural cringe about Perth that we would invite people like Jeff Kennett to Perth to insult us. And he said things like, Perth's so pristine, it's almost antiseptic. And if it had a heart, he couldn't find a heartbeat. And I think by this point, people are starting to travel a lot. They're seeing what cities like, you know, they're seeing the benefits of urbanity and activation around the world. And there's a kind of appetite to have some of this in the city and on the river, and that we can have a waterfront, you know, we can put Perth on the map with an iconic waterfront. So we start to see schemes like this, which were initially quite popular. Now that scheme crashed and burned, again with a change of state government, but by 2016 we built Elizabeth Quay, and I think there's, you know, I think it's been generally popular. The world didn't stop turning when we cut Riverside Drive, and I think it is, you know, the jury's still out, the buildings haven't gone up yet, that'll probably be the real test, but you know, there's a moment there to celebrate. There's been a lot of schemes that didn't get off the ground, and getting that one through is no small achievement. Finally, however, humiliation, how these many of my relationships have ended. So I guess today it's been very much about us trying to reshape the river, but in this phase that we're moving into now, it's very much about the river's ability to reshape the city. And I talk about that mostly in relation to sea level rise. This is really important because the Central Perth parklands, which were identified by the Department of Planning at Lands and Heritage, are very important from the perspective of, to some degree, ecosystem services, but also providing recreation, helping to, you know, to kind of define Perth's sense of place, are under threat from sea level rise. And this whole issue of reclamation is not just a spatial issue. It's not just a, you know, thing we need to build a wall and we'll fix it. I think this is also a bit indigeneity. The reclamation, in the true sense of the word, of land by the river carries a powerful symbolic load. As I discussed earlier, Perth's wetlands were and are to a degree perceived by Europe and Australia as a representative of the other, and particularly the unconscious and indigenous culture. Sea level rise and are ominous. For the Noongar, the Bolleter, the snake-like dreamtime creature, was responsible for the creation of the Swan and Canning rivers, as well as other waterways through the southwest. Moreover, the Bolleter is described as being a spirit which is responsible for punishing wrongdoers through illness or death. I think in our analogy here, the reclaiming of the city with the river there's a dimension of interpretation in relation to indigeneity there. And I think in terms of our romantic analogy, the Woggle is perhaps the mother-in-law. The assertion of the river's power, it's going monstrous, is from a certain perspective a powerful reminder of our historical neglect and wrongdoing, particularly as it relates to the river. I think this our connection of indigeneity in the river, I think, is real, because you look at all the indigenous cultural centres we've proposed along the river. There's been 7 of them. We've never built one. They're all there as the asterisks. But it seems to be the landscape by which we try and deliver reparations. And I think there's no coincidence that that's happening. Very quickly, I'm probably almost over time, but just looking, we're going to get a bit more scientific now. So, looking at sea level rise in a couple of sections around Perth water and what we're likely to see. So this is our assumptions. The scenarios are based around a kind of median projection for 2100, which is a 0.5 metre rise with a 0.7 metre high tide. And then to capture the possible effects of the interaction between flooding, storm tides and projected sea level rise, we've also included a 2.5 metre water level, which is what you're seeing there, which has been established by the Department of Water for floodplain management. So, look, it's going to happen, it's just a matter of when. It's going to be much worse than this too, but we shouldn't focus on exactly when it's going to happen. It's more like a process which is just going to unfold over time, and yes, we will get to that, and probably something much more dramatic. So things are fine at the moment. Once you get to that 1.2 metre level rise, which is just a high tide and not a storm surge or a big flood or anything like that, most of Langley Park's gone, and obviously when you get to 2.5 metres, then you've lost Langley Park, and the river is pretty much back to where it used to be. So, in a true sense of reclamation. So this is a report we did, we looked at the different opportunities for dealing with this situation. I think most of the residents would agree along there that the best one is fortification. However, they're extremely expensive. That's one of the problems. And there's no means by which, it's not obvious by how we would pay for this too. And you can't just do one section, obviously you have to continue it. So that's a bit of an issue. The other problem with a fortification strategy like this is that when it fails, it tends to fail in a fairly catastrophic kind of way, and I think New Orleans is one example of that. These kind of barriers also tend to reassure communities behind here, and if you're not careful, development will keep happening, which compounds the situation. And finally, why these things work in the short to medium term, they're unlikely to work over the longer term, not without significant ongoing investment. Other options are to just look at how you could actually start to accommodate, increased water levels, actually perhaps turning Langley Park back into a wetland, designing buildings which could float or have their main usable rooms above ground floor level. But even in this situation, there's got to come a point where you will need to pull back. And ultimately, we looked at the situation of retreat here, which is probably over the longer term what we're going to need to do, which is actually, and we're talking over 90 years here potentially, but the idea that as buildings get to the end of their lifespan, that you don't rebuild them, and eventually kind of actually transition this whole zone back to St George's Terrace, where it was originally meant to be. We did this whole model of just looking at these different sections. Now we're at Mill Point here, looking at the potential issues of fortification in Mill Point. And I have to, even at a 1.2 metre level here, you're going to need to be mechanically pumping this most days. And obviously at a 2.5 metre level, it's pretty much famous. We looked at South Perth foreshore. Things are not quite so dramatic there. But you could seek to retreat that over the longer term. The freeway interchange, it's very much, this is reclamation in a true sense of the word. By a 2.5 metre water level, the river has reclaimed Mounts Bay, which is originally where the shoreline was there at Mounts Bay. It actually becomes a bay again. So essentially, I think, I guess what we've been trying to do with these slides is just to make people aware that while we should and probably will do some fortification, and that while we should and probably will do some adaptation of river edges, over the longer term, I think we need to be realistic that this is largely going to require retreat to a significant degree. So this is the existing situation with the Central Perth parklands, which are essential dimension of Perth's kind of sense of place and how it sees itself. At the 1.2 metre level, we can start to see them being eaten away. And I think there's some actually potential in this too, because most of these edges are fortified at the moment, and so they sterilise ecology along the edge of the river. I think there's an opportunity, as this happens and as we prepare for that, to actually demineralise those edges and try and bring back some of those really fertile intertidal areas. At a 1.5 metre, 1.6 metre sort of level, we can see that we have lost Langley Park, and we're actually starting to eat into the urbanism at the foot of Terrace Road. The 2.5 metre level, which the Department of Water was using for floodplain management by 2100 as a figure to work to. Again, we have lost the central Perth parklands, and if we want to maintain those parklands, which are central to Perth's livability and identity, we are going to need to look at ways of retreating. And this really brings into question why we are still allowing significant and substantial developments to be occurring along the foot of the city of Terrace Road and on Mill Point, when we know this is going to happen. Now, this one's a little alarmist, but this is based on the effects of a 7 metre water level situation, which is projected by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's projected sea level rise by 2,500. Okay. You know, that's a long way off, but I think what I want to try and reinforce here is this is not something we can now stop. This process has been set in motion. And it's not like we will get to 2100, plan for it, and then we can walk away, job done. This is something that's going to be an ongoing process now for hundreds of years, no matter what we do. Ultimately, this is what we're looking for. And humiliation. I would say for a city that has endeavoured to reshape the river to its own ends, this is now very much the river returning that favour to us. The first part of this presentation was from my book, Take Me to the River, which you can get online, and the second part was a report which we did for the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, and was not just me, also Jörg Bauermeister, the director at the time, Zoe Myers, Bill Grace, and Ewan. Okay. So thanks for listening, and happy to take any questions later.
My name is Comiskey from the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. I'm a town planner, and I've been tasked with the development of the Perth Water Precinct Plan. So I'm here today to talk to you about it. I'll just start off by really setting a bit of context, and perhaps this is a bit of the bias of my own bias, and perhaps the bias of the Swan River Trust and the obligations under the Swan and Canning Rivers Management Act, but really understanding the significance of Perth water and the whole of Swan and Canning River is vital. It sets our whole context. It helps us understand and associate with the river and with the city. It sets our scene. So just briefly, the water levels rise and fall with the rain and tide. The fringing vegetation cleans and oxygenates the water as it enters the river, and the river cools Perth as it flows to the sea. So just a bit of context. Perth Water Precinct Plan. So it runs from Narrows Bridge to Windham Bridge. It is Perth water. The intent of the Perth Water Precinct Plan is, really, understanding Perth water. What is it really? It's a place of very significant Noongar importance. It's a place of spirituality. It's a gathering place for the entire Perth community, and it is the lungs of the city. When we're talking about Perth water, we're not just talking about the water. We're talking about the green space around it. So, the Perth Water Precinct Plan. The Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions has been tasked under State Planning Policy 210, the Swan and Canning Rivers, to prepare a range of precinct plans across the entire Swan and Canning River catchment, Swan and Canning Rivers. The Perth Water Precinct Plan really will provide a guide for future use, activities and development within Perth water. So when we're talking about that, we are talking about the whole range of activities. We're talking about land development, we're talking about use within the areas, so fence and so on, and we're really trying to establish a vision for how this space will continue to service the Western Australian community into the future. just very briefly, providing a bit of context in relation to what it will be. We've appointed Element and a project team for the preparation of the precinct plan. It will include a 5-year action plan by the various government agencies who are part of this process. It will, the whole intention is that this is a cross-agency program, a cross-agency policy that will be adopted by each of those policies. It is intended to align policy positions across those government agencies. I'll list through who those agencies are shortly. The focus for the project is strong community engagement. Really, it's going to address a lot of those gaps in current decision making and provide that clear and consistent vision for the future development of this area into the future. And it is ultimately intended to provide a balance. And we'll talk about what types of things it's going to be balancing shortly. Just briefly, who are the agencies that are part of this? We've got key local governments who have frontage to this part of Perth water, and it's within their boundaries. City of Perth, City of South Perth and Town of Victoria Park. We've also got Department of Transport, Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, Tourism Western Australia, the WAPC and the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. So it's a pretty hefty group of government agencies that are involved in this. As I said, the intent is that everybody will adopt it and implement it consistently. Let's set a bit of the scene of the types of things that it's supposed to achieve. So, if we're setting the scene, just step back for a moment and ask yourself, in the context of Perth water, which I imagine most of you will know very well, what would you like to see on Perth water? So what activities are appropriate on Perth water? We've currently got seaplanes, an ongoing seaplane trial. We've got private mooring activities. We've got a range of other uses that I'll talk about shortly. So should any type of privatisation or infill of the river be allowed for into the future? We've had proposals, which a number of you may or may have seen, which is the Swan River Deck. It's a private proposition. It represents long-term filling of the river. So you've got to ask yourself, are these the types of things that we want to consider? Perth Water Precinct Plan will have to provide direction in relation to this, because if it's appropriate, sure, we give them some policy guidance and we give them some support. If it's not appropriate, then we need to clear the way so that appropriate activities can occur into the future. Another beautiful view of the pool, which I think has a golf tee somewhere on the highest point of the building, of the site. We've got current proposals with the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, the old salt party barge, which is proposed to have a 21-year lease. Again, semi-privatisation of the river. Are these appropriate types of things for us to see into the future? Do we want to facilitate them into the future? We've got a whole lot of spaces on Perth water. We've got Elizabeth Quay, we've got Men Street Jetty, we've got Barrack Square. We've got the new sports stadium, the Optus Stadium. What do we want to see on the river? And how should we get across and around the city? Of course, the first question is, we've got the Matagara Bridge. Do we want to see more infrastructure such as this? We've got a current network of bike paths and pedestrian paths. How should these be maintained or improved into the future? And there's an image behind that. And we've got jetties. We won't worry too much about that image. Oh, actually, it was a great one. It was a photo of Riverside Drive. Looking up Riverside Drive, we've got, to be honest, whenever I have international or national visitors, I always drive them along Riverside Drive at night time on the way home because it is a gorgeous, beautiful, scenic space. Do we want to see Riverside Drive there into the future? The City of Perth are just embarking on, in cooperation with DPCA, are embarking on a program for preparation of Perth Foreshore Master Plan. It'll need to ask some of those questions, so be ready. Oh, sorry, that's the image of Riverside Drive. In the context of all this, what is our response to flooding and our response to the natural environment? At the moment, we have a lot of pressure for defence against nature. Solid revetment walls that will disperse the force of the water, that become that quite difficult space from an environmental performance perspective. Without passing any judgment, it kind of, well actually I can't pass judgment. I'm not particularly in favour of this type of development outcome along the foreshore, simply because of the impact that it does have on our capacity to interface with the river. So we've got other scenarios, such as a combination of revetments and natural interface with the water. We've currently got river walls. It's a very important question that will need to be explored by the City of Perth with their foreshore management plan. We've got more recent interfaces that have been constructed over at the City of South Perth, and some very lovely work that's been done by the City of South Perth in more recent years for creation of spaces where the community can touch and can feel the water. This foreshore improvement was recently done by the City of Perth in cooperation with the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. It is a combination of all of those things. It's in parts where those forces actually, the quite substantial river forces, interact with the shoreline and cause erosion problems. They've needed to incorporate some rock armour. But for the bulk of it, it is quite a soft interface. And finally, how do we interface with the river, and how does the river connect with us from a cultural perspective? Just have a read of that. Can people read it? I'll read it out loud just in case. The lullaby tree, the condal or she-oak, provided a peaceful place to rest for the Whadjuk people. A dense mat of soft condal leaves keeps the ground clear and creates bedding for a mia, temporary shelter. If you listen closely, you can hear the condal sing a soft lullaby in the wind which helps the children off to sleep. So, we all know she-oak. But really that tells a story about cultural connection, a very strong relationship that the Aboriginal community, the Whadjuk community, had with their space and with the river in particular. Then we've got it used for a whole range of other different uses. Of course, we've got the Skyworks, which the Perth community love. We've got markets on the South Perth foreshore. So all of these questions is really, where do you want to see, how do you want to use the Perth foreshore into the future? Finally, let me just give a really brief overview of some of the on-water scenario or restrictions that currently apply. So the green space, there are speed restrictions of 8 knots for any boats. The light blue space, that's open water. Then the pink spaces. Area number 4 is a commercial water ski area. So we have water ski commercial activities that are happening in that part of the water. We've got the WA powered water sports area, which is area number 5. Area number 5 is is really quite an interesting space. It's existed for some years, since I think 65 off the top of my head, and even before that, where it's been used for a range of entities that have now become the WA Powered Water Sports Association, I think. Now the question is how should that space used? At this point in time, there are significant restrictions. As a matter of fact, there are total restrictions on anybody swimming or canoeing through this space. This was put out to the Perth community during public consultation, and at that time it was a bit of a surprise to a lot of the Perth community that they don't actually have access to this part of the river. So, as you'd expect, there's discussion around this, and there's discussion around what role should that space play into the future. Should there be broader community access? In the context of the Powered Water Sports Association, it's vital for their continuing existence in this location. And it in itself represents a bit of interest and a bit of variety in what happens on Perth water. So it's not just a black and white. We can't just say, go away, we want everybody to have access. We'll need to work out a way through this. So, I've just blanked the screen. Right. We went out to community consultation. Before we actually prepared anything that actually said this is going to be our response to how we manage and how we plan for development within and around Perth water, we said, okay, well let's go out to the community and have a bit of a chat about what they think are the main issues. So there was a web-based, broad-based community consultation, and there were some more focused workshops. There was a Noongar workshop, a workshop with the local interest groups and community groups that are active within the Perth water, and there was engagement with government stakeholders, amongst some other things, but they're the primary consultation activities that occurred. What were the themes? So, to really facilitate the discussion, we thought, well, let's focus on the 5 key questions. The environmental context, which we called Let the River Breathe. Celebrating culture and community. The Noongar and broader Western Australian relationship with the space and how we use the space. A network of lively places and tranquil spaces. That talks to Barrack Square, talks to those community focal points, those activity nodes that currently exist or perhaps should exist into the future. See, touch and experience river life. That's the stuff that happens on water. So that is Old Salt Barge Company setting up a nightlife activity. The seaplane trial is currently ongoing. And more ways to get around and across. Of course, when we're talking about getting across the river, we're talking about ferries. We're also talking about pedestrian access. We're talking about new pedestrian bridges. We're talking about existing pedestrian and cycle networks. So, just look at the massive images. That is simply the range of comments and discussions that we received through our web-based consultation. The whole focus of this was to have a community consultation. It wasn't engendering discussion from the Perth community about the way that they associate and use and would like to use Perth water. So, the first theme, just in relation to the web-based consultation, the community had the opportunity to comment on various propositions that we incorporated into the website. And those propositions included things like, we suggested that we would enhance our existing places and destinations. So we would actually acknowledge the role that Elizabeth Quay plays, that Barrack Square plays, that Main Street Jetties plays, that some of those more subtle centres and nodes around Perth water actually play. But not necessarily suggesting that we will create new centres. or new high-intensity built nodes around the river. So that was the proposition. The community had the opportunity to discuss that. Another proposition was creating additional community activity spaces. So those are those lighter spaces where we're talking about. We might perhaps create opportunities for markets. We might create opportunities for, I don't know, mobile food vans, where they can pop up for a period, or at given times the community will actively venture to the spaces and do what communities do, live, laugh and play. All right, better ways to get across and around the river. So again, this touched on the ferries, bikeways, additional pedestrian paths, and you can just see the range of comments that were received there. There was, you'll notice a lot of thumbs down in relation to the WA powered water sports area. It's going to be an interesting thing, so watch this space. There were propositions around perhaps additional community moorings, courtesy moorings, propositions of consolidation or building new jetties for access to the water. And finally, let the river breathe. Oh no, sorry, second last. Let the river breathe. That focused on bringing the river, or bringing the Perth community to the river, and providing green connections, so going beyond just what constitutes Perth water and the river's edge and parkland around that, and saying, let's take the river up into the city. Other propositions included really softening that interface with the river as often as we can, providing for that those returned ecological communities. It also touched on the future of Harrison Island, discussing, well, what role does this need to play? It has such, it is so important to the Noongar community. It is so important in the way that we as a community associate with the space, and yet it is so, opportunities are so under-realised. Western Australian community has been talking about doing something on Harrison Island for a very, very long time, and they haven't done it. Now, you may say that's not such a bad thing. Finally, celebrating community and culture. Recognising and celebrating the whole Aboriginal cultural identity, and providing perhaps points that are able to be used as those identifying locations for the Noongar community, as well as as providing broad access from an Aboriginal community perspective to the river, and allowing the broader Western Australian community to understand Aboriginal knowledge and Aboriginal stories as it relates to Perth water. Okay, look, just some interesting stats. It was quite a well received consultation. On average, users were on the website for around 15 minutes. Now that's average, so some people will have been on there 2 hours, and others will have been on for a minute. But it generally indicates that people were quite engaged in relation to the website. There were over 2,000 individual users. There were 695 ideas and quick wins, or general comments, individual comments that were provided, and there were 503 responses to our propositions that we put out. And the key messages from the consultation. Well, there was a general presumption against the idea of importing Australian or tourism opportunities that are not unique to WA. There was a support for the idea of intensive and serene places, so recognising the benefit of, okay, understanding that we have some established community nodes, allowing for those nodes to continue or to consolidate, but not necessarily going beyond that. Expanding public ferries, very popular thing. There was really a strong preference for those sympathetic and low impact users. There was concern and confusion over the WA power to water sports area. And there was quite a strong sense of restoring the environmental integrity and the river's health. So that is in the context of the water as well as those green spaces. Finally, there was a respect and celebration of the Noongar spirituality and connection, better coordination and management across government. So general support for that idea, great idea, and genuine engagement. There was a call for that that continuing engagement of the Perth community. Again, softer foreshore treatment, as well as recognising the value that this space plays as a green space around the city and its unique qualities. So what's next? We'll be doing workshops with the Noongar community, more workshops so that we can actually really entrench the Aboriginal or Noongar context into the document. As well as that, following that, we'll start to prepare the actual policy. The draft precinct plan will be released around early next year, so stay tuned, it'll be very exciting. Thank you.